This is the story of what happened when a laser scanner flew over a valley in eastern Ecuador and found more than 6,000 earthen platforms sitting under the rainforest canopy. They are the remains of a settlement system raised from around 500 BCE, emptied between 300 and 600 CE, and older by roughly 1,000 years than any other complex Amazonian society we know of. Those findings reached print in January of 2024 in the journal Science from a team led by the French archaeologist Stephen Rostaing. Nearly every headline that followed reached for the same two words, lost city, and that phrase carries far more weight than it can hold. The Upano Valley sits in Morona, Santiago province, on the Amazon side of the Andes, and beneath its forest lies the oldest and largest urban complex ever identified in Amazonia. The valley runs roughly 100 kilometers long and about 20 wide, and above all of it stands the Sangay volcano, Ecuador's most active. According to the Smithsonian's Global Volcanism Program, it erupted more or less continuously from 1728 until 1916, then started again in 1934 without meaningfully stopping since. Settling beneath a volcano that erupts almost without pause sounds like poor judgment, and it isn't. Volcanic ash builds extraordinarily fertile ground, and Rostaing reports that farmers working the valley today pull 3 maize harvests a year. That soil is the reason a dense population could take root here at all. People noticed what had been built on it a very long time ago, and this is the part that usually gets compressed out of the coverage. February of 1978 is when an Ecuadorian priest named Pedro Ignacio Porras identified a ceremonial site called Guapula, later renamed Huapula, on a tip from a fellow missionary named Juan Botasso. Porras had no formal training in archaeology of any kind, having studied philosophy in Italy and pedagogy in Puerto Rico before crossing Ecuador as a missionary. 14 digs followed his first excavation across the next 6 years, amounting by his own accounting to 29,400 hours in the field, cutting paths with a machete and hauling finds out by mule. His 1987 monograph, 432 pages long, is the first systematic record of what sits in that valley. Rostaing arrived in Ecuador from 1996, and his excavations turned up platforms arranged around central plazas, decorated pottery, and large jugs still holding residues of chicha, the traditional maize beer. On foot across all those years, he and his colleagues located hundreds of mounds. Hold on to that number because it is the entire point of what happens next. 2015 is when Ecuador's National Institute of Cultural Heritage funded an airborne LiDAR survey of the valley, the first time LiDAR had been turned on archaeology anywhere in the country. The technique fires laser pulses at the ground from an aircraft, and while most strike the canopy, some slip through gaps in the leaves and reach the forest floor, letting you model the terrain with the vegetation stripped away. Here is a distinction almost every article on this subject fumbles. The government scanned 600 square kilometers of the valley, while the area analyzed and reported in the 2024 paper covers 300. Both numbers are correct, and they describe two different things. Then the data sat there. Bureaucratic delays kept it unreleased until roughly 2020 or 2021. After which Rostaing spent another 2 years on analysis alongside his colleague, Antoine Dorison. The line he eventually gave the Associated Press is the one that traveled around the world, that it was a lost valley of cities. Rostaing had located hundreds of mounds on foot, and the LiDAR showed thousands. More than 6,000 earthen platforms turned up, forming at least 15 settlements, 5 large and 10 smaller. A typical platform runs about 20 meters by 10 and stands 2 to 3 meters high, though some rise to 10 meters, and Rostaing reads those taller ones as ceremonial. At the other end of the scale sit mounds barely a meter tall, which is exactly why decades of ground survey undercounted them so badly. And then there are the roads. 10 meters across, about 33 feet, is the width of the largest ones, and they run between 10 and 20 kilometers. What matters more than the measurements is their character, because these roads are near perfectly straight. They cross at right angles and they disregard the terrain completely, cutting through ravines and over high ground instead of bending around either. Going around would have cost far less effort, which is why Rostaing argues the roads carried a symbolic function, though he presents that as a hypothesis. What resists argument is that a road system this straight demands planning across multiple settlements, which means those settlements stood at the same time. There is no stone in any of it. Unlike the Maya or the Inca, these builders worked entirely in earth, and Rostaing notes that nothing quite like this exists anywhere else in the pre-Columbian Amazon, Brazil included. The diet came down to maize, beans, manioc, and sweet potato, with the maize ground into a paste that fed the brewing of chicha, a beer nourishing enough to stand in for a meal. Dorison's analysis exposed a grid-like drainage system that pulled water from waterlogged soil so crops could grow in the gaps between platform complexes. Garden urbanism is the paper's term for the result, a low-density city where the farmland threads through the settlement instead of being pushed beyond its edges. The population figure deserves more care than it usually gets because it is the most hyped and least settled number in the story. Dorison told the Associated Press the site held at least 10,000 inhabitants, and perhaps as many as 30,000 at its peak, comparable to Roman-era London. In an interview published after the paper, though, Rostaing said the team was still trying to estimate the population, so that range is a working figure rather than a finding. Which brings us to the question that genuinely remains open. Volcanic activity supplied the old explanation because a layer of ash, 40 to 70 centimeters thick, turned up in archaeological exposures and was attributed to an eruption of Sungay. It makes for a tidy story, people building a civilization beneath a volcano until the volcano ends it. Two problems undercut it. Other archaeologists went hunting for that ash layer and failed to find it, and the science paper itself questions the eruption hypothesis because the radiocarbon dates refuse to line up. August of 2025 is when a separate team published in Nature Communications, and the picture moved again. Mark Bush of the Florida Institute of Technology and Crystal McMichael of the University of Amsterdam led a study built on a sediment core raised from Lake Cormorán, which sits within 10 kilometers of the mound complex. The core delivered a continuous record of vegetation change spanning 2,770 years, and the occupation, they concluded, ran larger than the LiDAR suggests, with people reworking the land as much as 10 kilometers beyond the known complex. Here is the part that matters most. No major ash layer appears at around 550 CE, and the only ashfall registering clearly in the sediment dates to roughly 1285 CE, centuries too late to explain anything, nor did they find evidence of abrupt abandonment anywhere in the record. What the sediment shows instead is a gradual return of forest from about 200 CE onward, with maize and charcoal both declining, a protracted falling away of human activity across centuries. The volcano did not end this, and as far as the best current evidence carries us, nothing sudden did. People slowly stopped. Rostaing has speculated that the population moved south into Peru, where similar pottery has been found, but he says plainly that no firm explanation exists. The valley did not stay empty, though. Between roughly 800 and 1200 CE, the Huapula culture moved back in, and they built nothing new. They settled onto the platforms the Upano had raised centuries before, worked the same fields, and walked the same roads. Which returns us to that phrase. Catherine Reese Taylor of the University of Calgary argues that Lost City is simply inaccurate because local communities and archaeologists have known about these mounds for a long time. The valley is inhabited right now, and many of the mounds, the tolas, sit on private farmland that people are actively working today. Calling the place lost erases both the indigenous present and 45 years of Ecuadorian research. A related tension runs through the question of credit. Rostaing told the art newspaper that Porras made a crude excavation whose only merit was revealing that mounds existed in the rainforest, while Ecuadorian institutions treat Porras as the pioneer. Both things can hold at once because an international team with new technology validated at scale what local researchers had been arguing for years. What nobody contests is what this does to the older model, the idea that the Amazon could support only small, mobile groups. Rostain frames those stakes bluntly, saying the finding undercuts racist and colonial attitudes toward indigenous peoples in Latin America. The site is under pressure now. Reporting from early 2024 documented machinery, road construction, erosion, and ordinary farming all endangering mounds that stand up to 4 meters high, while illegal mining works the Upano River itself. By May of 2026, a municipal inventory had identified more than 6,000 tolas inside the canton of Morona alone, a sign that the system runs larger than what has been mapped. There is also a gap in the protections, because Sangay National Park carries UNESCO World Heritage status, but is listed for natural criteria. The archaeology holds none at all. One last finding from the Lake Corps study reframes everything else. The forest around Lake Cormorán looks untouched, and it isn't, because the researchers concluded that its present plant assemblage may be as little as 120 years old. The rainforest hiding this place for 1,500 years is not a backdrop people happen to live in front of. It is a product of what people did and then stopped doing. We started with a laser scanner and 6,000 platforms. What that scanner actually found was a society that engineered an entire valley, its drainage and its roads and its forests, across 1,000 years, and then, for reasons nobody has yet explained, slowly let all of it go. The volcano did not do it, because the evidence rules that out. That is the honest state of the question, and it is why the Upano Valley is worth watching. Not because a lost city was found, but because a well-known place is only now being read properly, with much of it still under farmland, unprotected, waiting for someone to survey the other half.